Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Dennis, and I serve as Executive Director for the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology. Welcome to this show and tell event featuring the work of 4 artists and scientists living and working in residence at Sitka this winter. We want to thank the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation and Jordan Schnitzer for their extraordinary signature sponsorship of Sitka's 50th anniversary year. Our birthday's in May, so we're kind of going from May to May celebrating this birthday and their signature gift. Thank you so much. Thank you to our extraordinary sponsors and foundations who make our work possible. The James F. and Marion L. Miller Foundation, the Robert and Mercedes Eicholtz Foundation, Oregon Arts Commission, Oregon Cultural Trust, Explore Lincoln City, Framing Resource, Brian Potter Design, Park Lane Suites, and Siltstone Wines. We want to thank Sitka's co-founders, Jane and Frank Boyden, whose inspiration is evergreen. And oh my goodness, we want to thank our board of directors, whose sleeves are ever rolled up in service of Sitka's future. 2020 was no easy year to be a volunteer arts nonprofit board member. So thank you to our current and outgoing board members from 2020, Peg, Barb, Dan, Greg, Joe, Ruth, Kristen, Alan, Jennifer, Elizabeth, Gail, and Ryan. We are so grateful for your board service. We hope you will save some dates for upcoming events. Sitka is proud to present the Jordan Schnitzer Printmaking Residency exhibit at Waterstone Gallery in Portland, Oregon. The show is running now from January 12th through February 28th. So please check out the show. It's gorgeous. And special thanks to Lisa DeGrace from Sitka's team and everyone at Waterstone for making the exhibit possible. It's really beautiful. I can't wait to hear your thoughts about the show. You also have 3 more opportunities this winter and spring to meet Sitka's residents. Our 3 final show and tell events after this one tonight of the season are taking place on February 28th, March 15th, and April 22nd. Those are all from 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, all on Zoom like this event. We hope to see you there, and it means so much to our residents when you come to events like this one. For those of you participating live with us on Zoom today, if you have questions or comments for our presenters, please do share them using the Q&A feature on your Zoom menu. Time permitting, I will read what you share and do my best to fit in as many comments or questions as I can, just keeping an eye on and honoring everyone's time. But please, if you've got something to say, please do reach out through the Q&A. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our first presenter. Ayla Gizlice is a Turkish-American artist who works primarily in mixed media sculpture and installation. She earned a BA with highest honors in studio art and a BS in environmental science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her study of environmental science informs her work both conceptually and materially, as does her relationship with the Turkish landscape. She often works with materials found and collected from her local environment and is interested in the ecological proposition that this labor poses. She was born and resides in Raleigh, North Carolina, except right now she's residing at the Sitka Center on the Oregon coast. While Ayla unmutes herself, I want you to unmute yourselves in your living rooms or wherever you are. Please make some noise and help me welcome Ayla to the Sitka community.
Hi, thank you, Allison, for that introduction. I'd like to start by saying a big thank you to everybody at the Sitka Center. I'm so excited to spend some time in this space and in this incredible landscape. And because I just arrived a couple days ago, I'm going to just focus on my past work, and I'll touch a little bit on what I'm working on while I'm here. So I'm gonna start with my senior thesis. During my time at UNC, like Allison said, I studied environmental science and studio art And I spent a lot of time researching water quality issues in the Haw River subbasin where UNC is located. And at the center of a lot of these water quality problems is a lake called Jordan Lake. And like a lot of lakes in the Southeast, it's created by a man-made dam. Um, and as a result, it has a lot of problems with stagnation because of nutrient runoff. And um, so the summer before my senior year, I visited the lake for the first time after having studied it a lot sort of theoretically. And I was really shocked to find a lot of dead fish washed up on the shores. And so that was really disturbing to see this like really physical manifestation of the things that I'd studied. So here's a photo of the installation view. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of pieces. This one is consists of the bones and bodies of the fish that I found. So the bodies I started collecting in the summertime, and then later in the winter, the bones. And I made these little vessels for them out of clay that I gathered from the lake shore. And it's unfired. So the idea is that when this piece stops being interesting to me, I can just sort of put it back in the lake and it'll just dissolve into clay again. And yeah, so I made the vessels sort of in the shapes of the bodies and the bones, sort of as an act of overdue care to the fish. And the other piece that I want to talk about from this body of work is this map that I made using GIS. And I plotted out the points in the Haw River subbasin where there have been fish kill events in the past 20 years or so since data has been collected. And I printed each of these little panels on watercolor paper using cyanotype, just a light sensitive photography method. And I used the bones that I gathered as the data points when I was developing the images. And after I graduated, I wanted to go in a different direction for a couple of reasons. I guess I was pretty frustrated about how my thesis kind of like presented these really sad problems without posing any kind of solution. And I wanted to talk about environmental protection in a way that seemed more fun and not so heavy. And so I also, outside of the academic institution, felt more freedom and flexibility um, to make work about the Turkish landscape and culture. So I held this free public workshop where I taught a group of 15 people how to make sarma, which is it's stuffed grape leaves, but instead of using grape leaves, I used kudzu leaves. And so I thought that it was, well, for those who don't know, kudzu is a really prolific vine that is engulfing a lot of the Southeast. And it's an invasive species. So I kind of liked the gesture of people devouring the invasive species to curb its spread. But of course, it is just sort of a humorous gesture. It's not a real solution. And then I was accepted into a year-long residency program at an organization called Anchorlight in Raleigh. And I started preparing for the show that would come at the end of the residency. And I wanted to make kilims, or traditional Anatolian flat weave carpets, to cover the floors of the gallery. And I had this idea of imposing a map of the region's waterways and damming projects over the traditional compositions of the kilims. Turkey is an increasingly water poor nation, and these damming projects are complicated in that they are damaging to the ecosystem, and they often flood inhabited or historically significant areas, but they also provide water for towns and allow people to grow food. So the lake pictured here exists on the site of an ancient Hittitian city, but it also supports a kiln making co-op where many of the women in my family work. And I was interested in that tension between the ancient and the modern that this posed. But I quickly realized that if I wanted to have a kiln show, it would take years and years because it's just a really, really slow process. So instead, I had a show that was sort of a recreation of part of the Turkish landscape that I'm most familiar with, the Çukurova Plain, which is in south, it's east a little bit, kind of like where the, kind of near like the northeastern corner of Syria, but it's in Turkey. So I guess in a time of like a lot of heightened tension between the Turkish government and the American government, I wanted to make a quiet, reflective space to just kind of take a break. So here's an installation view of that show. And so I had a fleet of 12 olive trees, and they were housed in these big pots that I made from clay collected around Raleigh. And the pots are all hand built, so they're all sort of different shapes, and that, kept it fun making 12 pots. And I pit fired them, which gave them this sort of organic texture on the surface. And I was interested in sort of the contrast between that and the branches of the trees. And they're all on wheels, so every day I would roll them over to the windows of the gallery so that they could get sunlight, and then they would roll back into place. And I was pretty worried about them because the show was up for 2 months, but at the end they seemed healthy, so I was glad about that. And um, another part of this installation was this dark little room that I made, and I titled it Worm's Eye View of the Peanut Field. And it had 800 clay peanuts suspended from the ceiling. And peanuts are not native to Turkey, but they grow really, really well in this region, and they're really celebrated. So in Osmaniye, my father's hometown, there are a lot of monuments to the peanuts themselves, but then also to the people who grow them. And I was interested in the way that these monuments speak pretty directly to people's relationship to the landscape, but also how different they were from the monuments that are common in North Carolina. So in a way, this room was another monument to the peanuts. And peanuts also play a really important role where I live normally. And so I invited viewers to spend time in the dark, just letting their eyes adjust and letting the peanuts reveal themselves slowly. And this is a photo of the floor of the room. The pinholes cast these ethereal reflections, and it was kind of just an accident, but I was pretty happy with the outcome. And the floor is covered in kilns, but these are just kilns from the kiln co-op that I own them, I didn't make them. And I also wanted to include something that very directly grounded the show in the landscape. So I included photos that I took walking around on Google Maps. And in a way, these are really traditional landscape photos, just captured in a digital model of the landscape. And I played with their positioning on the wall and also put sort of blinders on the boxes to manipulate the way that you could view the box or view the photo. And during my time here, I'm working on more kiln weaving using natural dyes and materials that I plan to gather. And as I mentioned before, it's a really slow process. So having time and space and just, time to breathe and reflect is really, really wonderful. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Isla. There's a question from Nancy. Does the rug co-op your family is part of have a web presence?
It does, yeah. I can put that in the chat if you'd like.
That would be great. Thank you. And on a personal note, I have to say that a fleet of olive trees is my new favorite collective noun of 2021. Thank you so much for sharing your work and welcome to Sitka. Our next presenter is Emily Jane Davis. Emily Jane Davis is an assistant professor and extension specialist in the Department of Forest, Ecosystems, and Society at Oregon State University. She's also associate director of the Ecosystem Workforce Program and vice chair of the Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition. She is a social scientist who analyzes natural resource collaboration, wildfire, public lands policy, and rural community development. She also provides technical assistance and support to a variety of collaborative and partnership efforts. Dr. Davis holds a Bachelor's of Arts from McGill University and a Master's of Arts and PhD from the University of British Columbia. We're so pleased to have Emily Jane with us. Please make some noise wherever you are and welcome Emily Jane to the Sitka Center.
Thank you, Allison. It's an honor to be here with the other residents and the staff and the community. And I also especially want to thank former resident Bruce Byers and locals Dan Twitchell, Duncan Berry, and Paul Robertson for bringing Sitka into my world. As Allison noted in her introduction, as a social scientist, I'm really dedicated to understanding, analyzing, and then innovating different approaches to how different people collaborate in natural resource management. And this really is at the heart of how they interconnect to each other and the natural world. In the context for this is that there are so many different people and organizations that have different values for natural resources. They have different ways that they connect and interact with them, and they have different levels and types of power relative to these resources and each other. So how do they come together across those differences, seek agreement, and take action together collectively to manage natural resources? So those are the kinds of questions I primarily engage in through my research, focused on the topics of forest restoration, wildfire suppression, wildfire risk reduction, and watershed restoration mainly. In addition to being a scientist, I have another interesting role called extension specialist, where I take those best practices from the scientific literature and the experiences that people have, and I try to directly assist people with implementing those and understanding those. So this means activities like facilitation, building others' capacity to design good processes, and documenting and sharing lessons learned through things like peer exchanges or case studies or briefings. So this is a really interesting job. But growing up, I was not really on the track for this job, or I didn't seem like a likely candidate. First, I was painfully shy and preferred to read and write by myself and never be seen. Second of all, I had a front row seat to a unique form of direct democracy where I grew up. This is a town meeting in the town of Plainfield, New Hampshire, where citizens get together and it's a form of direct democracy where they debate and decide on local matters of town government. And they've been doing local government this way since 1761 when the town was founded. These are folks in my town last year. However, I was deeply unappreciative of this. I found the process quite boring as a child, and even worse, mortifying on the occasions in which my own parents would stand up and participate in this direct democracy. But some seed must have been planted in that childhood and lay waiting to bloom later in life. Because when I reached graduate school, I became really fascinated with what was known as place-based or community-based natural resource management. I really wanted to understand how and why people came together to understand natural resource decision-making and how they managed the places they lived in and cared about. I wanted to know how that worked. So it was in Oregon that was the ground that this seed was able to take root and blossom from the East Coast. So when I arrived for a job here, I pretty quickly realized that community or place-based natural resource management was was the way things got done in Oregon. It's actually happening extensively here and has been for a long time. We really seem to believe here in Oregon that if you have locally scaled voluntary organizations throughout the state, that they can be effective hubs for helping people restore lands and waters, particularly if they're nested within larger supportive frameworks and partnerships. And what these all have in common is they promise locally appropriate collaborative solutions that make sense in their local context. And in Oregon, many of you know, we have many of these organizational forms. So we have over 60 watershed councils. Since the mid-1990s, those have been around as local partnerships for planning and implementing watershed restoration and fish habitat activities. And they're intended to represent a balance of interests in their watersheds. We have over 20 federal forest collaborative groups, with the first one starting in 1992, but many of them forming more recently. And these convene diverse stakeholders to have dialogue about different values for managing our public forest lands, primarily those that are managed by the US Forest Service. We also have over 20 rangeland fire protection associations, which are groups of ranchers that work together with the Bureau of Land Management in Eastern Oregon, where there's huge distances, it's very remote, and they work to be the first ones to put out wildfires when they start. You often don't hear about these wildfires on the news because they've been stopped before they start, and that helps protect sage-grouse habitat as well as ranchers' livelihoods. So these are just a few examples that you know in Oregon. We also have groups like land trusts, soil and water conservation districts that are all similar models. And I know that many of you on today are familiar with this right in your own backyard. You had the Lower Salmon Project that many of you were involved in. You've been part of discussions about how do we manage the biosphere reserve with consideration for local communities. So I know that you appreciate this culture of collaboration that I'm talking about, and that it's at home here in this place. Over the years that I've spent studying natural resource collaboration and trying to help different places, I've started to see common threads. These are often the same kind of stories, the same kind of ingredients, regardless of the context of the place or how disparate they might seem. So for example, I was starting to see many commonalities in how these place-based processes function. And some of the same processes would happen again and again, regardless of what the issue was. One of these was that time spent developing that shared purpose. So recognizing our interdependence, recognizing the need for collective action, and particularly establishing shared language or concepts about why we're working together and what we'd like to do. A lot of processes use available science and information to help make their decisions. Seeking consensus, that's the heart of all of it, trying to find ways that different interests can reach agreement, which involves exploring different values and trying to reach compromise. And then kind of monitoring what happens, monitoring outcomes, learning from those, and maybe changing course and changing behavior as a group. So I just started to see these again and again, although the order in which these things happen and how formally or informally they happen, of course, varied quite a bit by place and context. And I also started to see that when these efforts were achieving something, they tended to have some of the same features. They had to have a compelling enough problem and or opportunity that people and organizations wanted to work together and no single entity could solve it. There's always champions, people who are so excited about this, or it really matters to them that they take leadership roles. There's always some kind of facilitation that really created a space for people to be able to work together. And then oftentimes, this being Oregon, a lot of our state agencies and our nonprofit organizations provide external support to these efforts, resources, incentives, or encouragement that have been really important as well. In my unusual position, which is totally funded by grants, though, I don't really get to look at this whole picture and at these themes. I get asked to look at a piece here or a few places there, and write a report about one thing at a time. I'm also not asked to question fundamental aspects of this model either, or probe really deeply. So my major goal for this residency is to think big and look closely at something I'm really deeply invested in. I'd like to reflect more holistically and syncretically on this Oregon way for community-based, place-based natural resource management, and develop a vision for a future home for these reflections. This may be a book proposal, or it may be another home in some other media form. I don't know. what I really hope to do is to go beyond some of the normative lists of best practices and necessary ingredients like I just rattled off, because that's mainly what I get asked to do in my job. I want to dig beyond that in order to consider how we might more explicitly recognize that there are these complex terrains of values, connections, and power at play in this model, and they underpin and shape it really significantly. So what I mean by this, for example, might include big picture conceptual questions like, what does place mean? What does community mean? And who is included and excluded by different definitions of that? How do we acknowledge and work in the context of the history of how Indigenous peoples were displaced by settler colonialism for the lands and waters that we're all trying to collaborate on now? And when collaborative decisions are made, who benefits from the outcomes and who is excluded from those benefits? And then, as I said, I want to look more closely at the fine texture of the ground too, at the micro processes of practice. There's some really human questions about how this all works that often aren't visible, like who really carries the daily work and the emotional work of collaboration? How are they remunerated for that or not? And at what cost does that come? Whose voices are heard and not heard in the way we think of having dialogue in the cultures we create in these rooms, given how it's structured and how accessible may that be or may not be. And then finally, there are some pretty big picture questions about the collaborative model for the future. How particularly are we going to have collaborative processes that are going to be resilient in the face of change and challenge? There's so many different types and speeds of change in natural resource management and in life. We have people coming and going. Your champions can leave. You have events like floods or wildfires. You have public events like pandemics, which really change your opportunity to meet face to face. Shifts in policies and economies occur too at various scales. So how do we have resilient processes that accommodate the uncertainties and the unknowns and that evolve when needed? So to finish and to return to where I started, I want to acknowledge again what Sitka does for residents in providing this space and this opportunity for us to create and think without judgment. After spending years in a career that's been focused on helping people work together, I've been brought pretty far afield from that formerly shy self who would be sliding down in her chair at having to talk to other people or be at a town meeting, but that person is still inside me. So she rejoices at the unprecedented gift that you all provide for us. Thank you.
Emily Jane, thank you so much. There's a comment from Nancy who says, just so excited that you were here at Sitka to think on place and community, Emily Jane. And then in the chat, there's a comment, Emily, from Judy, who says, I think your hometown is proud of you. And then Judy also has a question for Ayla. Judy's putting words to it, but I think we were all thinking it. Judy shares, I love the thoughtfulness in your pieces. Ayla, how did you suspend the peanuts?
I put.
Do you want to yourself and answer that for all of us?
Yeah, you want me to do it out loud?
We're dying to know. Yeah, okay. Let's do it.
Okay, I put a wire inside it while the clay was wet, and then so it was strung up with a wire to a wire grid ceiling. So yeah.
Thank you, Ayla. And thank you, Emily Jane. Our next presenter is Danielle Cleaves. Danielle has exhibited at notable galleries and museums across the United States and in Canada. Her current body of work explores and disrupts ideas of social expectations and gender norms, representing queer bodies in utopic settings. She spent much of 2019 and 2020 participating in domestic and international artist residencies, most recently at Monson Arts in Maine, and we are overjoyed that she is now here with us in residence at the Sitka Center. Danielle received her MFA in Visual Arts from Lesley University College of Art and Design in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 2017. Please make some noise and help me welcome Danielle to the Sitka community.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm like very, very excited to be here. So for this brief intro to my work, I figured I would start with my most recent exhibition, discuss how the work evolved to get to that point, and then briefly cover some of the problems I hope to tackle while at Sitka. and things I want to think about while in residence. So. All right. So this is House Fire House Party at Installation Space in North Adams, Massachusetts. House Fire House Party was an immersive art experience featuring a crowd of life-size wooden, impassive, introspective partygoers, vibrant colors, and apocalyptic imagery. The figures in the exhibit were captured in moments of uncertainty and isolation, close in proximity but emotionally distant. There's a sense of the in-between without a clear narrative regarding what would come next. They were deep in their individual interior experiences while the world burned around them. Through this body of work, I explored themes of apathy, loneliness, temporary remedies, and crowds in the age of COVID-19. There's just a few scenes from the show. And I started this project like pretty soon before COVID. So I have very few pictures of like people interacting in the space. But it does get like pretty confusing pretty quickly because they're life-size figurative cutouts. So it looks crowded walking into one of the shows. So I started making the wooden cutouts like a little over a year ago. It started from a project I was working on called the Aimless Pilgrimage Project, which was a series of paintings, but it was an exploration of the individual experience within a group, specifically focusing on feelings of loneliness, isolation, and inaccessibility. So it started with these paintings where I was collaging photographs that were like individual, a person alone in the photo. So it would have this really awkward, disconnected feeling. Just photo, like people that really don't belong together in the space. Like this one, you can see the red shoe leg like goes to nobody. It's just like a real mashup of a crowd. So when I first started making them, it became this question of like how to display them, like how to present them. So initially I was imagining them as like public art installations, like bringing them into different spaces. So it's really hard to include everything in like a cohesive timeline, but right before, so in between doing these Aimless Pilgrimage paintings and before starting the wooden cutouts, I had a series called Utopia, where I worked to explore and disrupt ideas of social expectations and gender norms. And that started with the idea of presenting queer bodies in utopic settings, because utopia as a word was coined in 1516 by Sir Thomas More, from the Greek utopos, which literally translates to no place or nowhere. And I like the idea like a perfect place is subjective and it's just decided by those who are like in power, have the power to write history. So I was working on these, so it felt like a direct line, like to bring the wooden cutouts, which is largely members of my queer community, and place them in spaces that are known to be like utopic spaces. So after that, I was thinking of other ways to display them, like if I were going to show this work like in a gallery space. So I started with this sort of shadow box collage format. I think collage is a really powerful tool. And I mean collage like placing paintings and objects next to each other so that like concept changes the, or context changes the meaning. So I think it starts to set a wider scene. Like I think having beer cans next to scenes of utopia, next to scenes of like destruction and apocalypse hits on a vibe that would be really difficult to get from like one individual work. And this is from House Fire House Party. So the other thing I think is kind of great about the collage format is that you can really respond to whatever space you're in, because you can like expand it or shrink it, like depending on where you're showing the work. So you can, it like can really fit the space. So this is a couple of months into starting the project. I had sort of accumulated all of these wooden friends And then I had a residency at Atelier Silex in Quebec, and they gave me this like big open space. So suddenly there's a new problem of how to show the work in this like as a three-dimensional object, where before they really needed to be against a wall because the backs had nothing going on. So that's when I started painting the backs of the figures, which was like a really exciting move, I think, because it goes back to the Utopia series. Usually when I'm painting figures, I tend to like render a lot more. And I think it's because I'm really interested in like the psychology of the individual and the expressions. And I just like get kind of caught up in it, but I'm like looser and much more colorful in the backgrounds. So it was able to like bring that back into them. And it becomes this really interactive experience because as you circle the little pods, the figure's roles shift because it goes from being the backdrop to being the foreground as you move around the space. And this is just to show the sort of the accumulation of all of the stages of where it's gone so far. So this is within the last year. So I feel like it's gonna make constantly be changing, but I'm excited at the direction it's moved in. Yeah, so moving forward while in residence here, I really want to push myself further out of my comfort zone. So I want to play a lot more with, like I had recently started making these big backdrops for the figures, and I want to play much more with depth and make them interact more and overlap more versus having this like two-dimensional background with a two-dimensional figure in front of it. So I'm really excited to kind of like merge that space and play more with like world building. And stop share, and then I'll show. So what I'm working on right now is some friends in the bathtub. And that the new project I'm working on is based on this apartment I was renting for the last few months, which was this really bizarre space curated by the artist Michael Chapman with like really strange taxidermy and a hidden room behind a liquor cabinet and just bizarre objects. So I think it's a really cool opportunity to explore themes of like false histories and temporary spaces and ownership and expectations. So that's kind of what I'm excited about now. And then these are oil studies of the Oregon coast because I had never seen it until like 4 days ago, and it's magnificent. So I definitely am excited to spend the next couple of months like slowing down and really trying to appreciate this environment because it's amazing, and I'm so thankful to be here. And that's it.
Thank you, Danielle. There's a comment from Deborah in the chat who says, "Oh, I wish I could see these artworks in person." And that kind of, I have a question that's kind of related to that. I'm just so curious, the images of the figures in close proximity to each other in the gallery spaces in the time of COVID, it just seemed really striking to have those people but not people close together in ways we can't be close together right now. Have you thinking about, or have you been thinking about these humans that you share space with in different ways than we get to share space?
Yeah, it's been really bizarre because I had started this like so soon before COVID too. So it was like a really strange time to be working with crowds. But that last show, it was 4 people allowed at a time into the gallery space. So the people walking through the space, like masked up and everything, were so outnumbered by these wooden figures. So it's definitely a bizarre experience.
And there's one more question. Nancy says, you describe your figures as members of your core community. Are these works based on people you know? Have you always felt a friendship to your work?
Yeah, I do quite a few artist residencies, so it tends to be a lot of artists. And I think I actually said queer community, not core community. But yeah, core as well. Yes, it's a lot of like friends, peers, artists.
And one more question from Mike, who says, your paintings of the Oregon coast look like portraits. How have you encountered landscape like people?
Oh, that's so fascinating. I see that now, like, I feel like I should walk over, but I have been painting them kind of like portraits. I'm pretty new to painting straight up landscapes. So I think it's going to be interesting the next couple of months, but I guess I do kind of go into everything in that way with like the main subject.
Danielle, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and our final presenter is Janet Morrison. Janet Morrison is a professor of biology at the College of New Jersey, TCNJ, where she conducts plant ecology research with undergraduate students, teaches ecology and botany courses, and has served as department chair and in many other leadership roles. She was the founding director of faculty-student collaboration at TCNJ and also held its first endowed chair, the Pelson Chair in Faculty-Student Engagement. Morrison's scientific research program aims to understand how intersections between species drive the structure of ecological communities, particularly within human-transformed urbanizing landscapes. She also conducts research about faculty undergraduate research collaboration, is an elected counselor for the National Council on Undergraduate Research, and helps lead TCNJ's Inclusive Excellence in Science Education initiative, founded by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. She also has begun to connect her scientific practice with an artistic practice, which will allow her to translate and communicate her data-based findings to a wider audience through visual art. Janet earned her PhD in ecology and evolution from the State University of New York at Stony Brook and a BA in biology from Oberlin College. She held a research position as forest ecologist at the New York Botanical Garden prior to becoming a faculty member at TCNJ in 1997. And now she's here with us at the Sitka Center on the Oregon coast. Please make noise and welcome Janet Morrison to the Sitka Center.
Thank you so much, Allison. And thanks to all the previous residents. I loved all of your talks. I'm really excited for all of your work. And I'm really pleased to be here in this amazing, amazing landscape. So that was a pretty good background on me. So I don't need to tell you too much about me. I have been a professor since 1997. And as you can tell from that bio, I'm very dedicated to being a scientist in collaboration with undergraduates, and that's really informed a lot of my work. But we do real science, and that's what I want to talk to you about at first, and then I'll switch over to show you some images associated with that. So this year I'm on sabbatical, which is a great thing if you're an academic. Every 7 years you get a year if you want to do something else. And 7 years ago, or 8 years ago, I guess, my previous sabbatical, I started the project that I'm going to talk to you about today and that I'm working on now. And so I'm spending this sabbatical year at the tail end of that project doing a lot of data analysis and writing. So being able to be at Sitka for some very intensive, quiet time to do that, gazing out at the Pacific Ocean and wandering in the forest every day is going to be great. And it's going to allow me to think differently, I think, about my work. And I'll tell you why in a minute here. So I am a scientist, but I have been always sort of an amateur artist. And as part of my sabbatical, I want to be more intentional about having an art practice. And so I have decided to spend part of my time this year and some of my time here at Sitka figuring out how I can translate my own scientific data into sort of visual representation that can communicate with more people. So I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end. So the study that I've been working on since before 2012, and I'm now working on the tail end of it, is a project that I've done in collaboration with undergraduates that I was fortunate to be funded by the National Science Foundation for 6 years to work on this pretty long-term experiment. And the title of it is Deer times Invasives, Interactive Effects in the Herb Layer of Suburban Forests. So I could unpack a lot of information in that title. Let me start with invasives. We already heard about kudzu, which I think that's like really fun that you can that you can make stuffed kudzu leaves. So kudzu, the vine that ate the South, is a typical example. So there are many species, as I'm sure many of you know, that have been introduced to new places, typically from other continents that have a similar biome. So where I'm from in New Jersey, that's the temperate deciduous forest. So we have many, many species that come from Northern Europe and East Asia, which also has temperate deciduous forest biome. And in my region, which is sort of ground zero for the urbanizing landscape, this is central New Jersey, we have a very large number of species from both Asia and Europe, plants, earthworms, insects, birds, you name it. And there's a huge amount of interest in the scientific ecological community to understand what those species are doing when they become when they colonize at a high rate and become what we call invasive species. And so there's a lot of sort of idea that those kinds of species can have, extra strong effects in the community. And that's certainly the possibility in the areas which we work. At the same time, there's another very strong potential driver of the ecology in this landscape, which is very high densities of white-tailed deer. So in the area that I work, our densities are on the order of 40 deer per square kilometer. And so that is really tremendous. So as an ecologist interested in how species interact with each other to structure natural communities and working in central New Jersey, it seemed very interesting to me to try to tease apart how important invasive species are and their competition with the natives versus or with these overabundant white-tailed deer. So in order to approach this problem, I've taken a big field experimental approach. We have 6 different forests that we've been studying in since 2012. And we've taken this experimental approach by building these deer exclosures in about 40 plots in each forest. It's quite a large scale experiment for an ecological experiment. And so half the plots have this deer exclosure fencing around them since 2013. And then in each of those 2 groups, the deer with the deer without the deer, we've also manipulated the population of a very particularly important invasive plant species called Japanese stiltgrass. And so that's also in an experimental setting. So half of the plots got stiltgrass, half of them didn't get stiltgrass. In these forests where that species already exists, but not in the plots that we had started in. So we set this up in early 2013, and since then biennially been measuring all kinds of things, mostly in the herb layer of the forest. The herb layer are very important because it's sort of the future of the forest. All the tree seedlings are there, and a lot of the biodiversity in the plant community is there. So we've been measuring that along with a lot of other environmental variables in each of these forests. And so our overall question here is, how is the structure of the vegetation? How many species? How much of it is there? How much of that is driven by competition from this invasive species and other invasive species versus herbivory, being eaten by these white-tailed deer, or maybe it's like a sort of perfect storm of those 2 things acting together. So we're focused on things like the species richness, how many native species are there, the overall community. So what I want to do now is I'm going to show you some images and talk over those. Give you an idea. So here, so everybody can see that. Here we have a typical forest in the middle of the summer in central New Jersey, and you can see that there's hardly anything in that below what we call the browse line. So right here, you can see this green line, that's at 1.4 meters. That's how high the deer eat. So we really do have these herds of deer, and you can see a herd, this is in our neighborhood, right on the edge of the forest. And they love that habitat transition from a forest to an open field. That's perfect deer habitat. That's what we have in the fragmented landscape in suburbia and sort of exurbia, in addition to no predators and very little hunting because of proximity to human settlement. And you can see the strong effect of deer. Here's one of our plots that have a deer exclosure cage on there since 2013. This was taken this past late summer. You can see the tremendous regrowth inside of the fence compared to outside of the fence. So very strong effects from deer for sure. Here's another typical forest in our area, except this one does have a lot of plants on the forest floor in the herb layer, but that's almost all Japanese stiltgrass with a few other mostly non-native species mixed in. So this also has the potential for having like very strong competitive effects because of its incredible density and its ability to spread really, really quickly.
Hey, Janet, just a quick comment that we are not seeing your share screen. Do you want to try just?
Oh, shoot. I wish you'd said that. I'm sorry. Yeah, maybe I forgot to share. Sorry. Okay, hold on. I'll just sorry about that. Thanks.
You've got time.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. Okay.
Yay, thank you.
Sorry, okay, I'll just quickly show those again. Beginning. Okay, so here's that empty forest that I was talking about and the browse line going right down there. Thank you. And here, a herd of deer on the edge of the forest, perfect habitat for deer, and incredible regrowth of the vegetation inside of the cages in the forest. But sometimes the forest is covered with this stilt grass. So these two strong possible drivers is what we're trying to get at. And we took this experimental approach. So here's a little invasion of this stilt grass that came from our experimental treatment. And that gives us a lot of power to tease apart the different effects of these two species and other things that we're studying. And so what we're trying to get at is what's happening to species like this. So this is Quercus prinus, the chestnut oak. We have a lot of oaks in these forests, but very few juveniles in the understory. And so there's a question of what's going to happen to the canopy. And I always say the actions in the herb layer. So these plants, they need to survive and get through that deer browse zone and overcome that competition in order to make it into the canopy. And then there's the spring wildflowers, of which we're very depleted in these forests. This is a beautiful wild geranium. So our work is focused on how these kinds of species are being affected by these two important drivers. Like I said, in order to study this, we take this quantitative data. We study the herb layer in a numerical kind of way and then analyze it statistically. And I did so much of it that I became obsessed with those images that I was looking at this forest floor all the time when I first set this up. And so I made this painting. This was the first time I tried to make a painting or something that was connected to my scientific practice. So here I sort of abstracted that herb layer and I outlined within these little frames that we measure it, the different forms that we would look at and try to then estimate the percent cover of it. And this work was very much about pattern recognition, because you look at the form of the plant and you see all of the pieces of it that are in that square and try to estimate how much percent cover is in that. So that is the idea that I want to bring forward in this little artwork that I want to do. And it's going to be focused on sets of quartets of images. And the first quartet are going to be 4 photographs, and these are the 4 I've selected. So I took many photographs of the herb layer. And what I want them to do is to represent what I see in the statistical result. And so here you can see in this set of images that across the top 2 are plots where the deer were absent, the bottom 2, the deer were present, and the ones on the left is when there is no stilt grass present, and the one on the right, stilt grass is present. And you can see just visually how much more there is, both species and abundance, in the plots where the deer is absent. And that's what we're finding in the statistical result, that the deer look like they're much stronger drivers than the invasive species. So the other quartets are going to be a set of drawings, and then a set of paintings, and a set of mosaics. And the drawings are going to try to convey this statistically supported result through images of form, and then the paintings with color, and then the mosaics sort of harking into the granular nature of data. So the one that I've been working on so far is the drawings, and this is a sample kind of sketch thing that I tried to do. The idea here, I liked how this turned out. I like the gridded nature of it, because we actually measure these plants actually in plots that are on a grid and in these sort of little grids. So I kind of, this connects to the practice of science. And the idea here is to show, without really color, the strongly different forms of the plants and represent them related to how many of them there were in a plot. So you can imagine a plot like this would have had many different plants and quite filled up, but then there might be plots where there's hardly anything in there, as you saw in those photographs. And I like this, but I'm not sure it really got to my desire to really communicate the form. And so then I started some other kinds of examples, and I really like how this turned out. This represents a beech leaf, and it's really accentuating very simple form characters. And what I like also about this is how I teach students to identify all these plants. We look at a set of characters that make a plant stand out, rather than just saying, this is a beech leaf. this is, you can see this extremely strongly parallel veins and the pointed tips that they go all the way out to the tip. And that is how I teach the student about that. And what I also liked about this is that it looks like an X-ray. And if you think of an X-ray, that's, you know, that's really revealing the basic form of, you know, a vertebrate that has bones in it. So these are sort of like little plant X-rays. So I think what I'm going to do for this quartet of drawings is to meld together this technique with that array of grids and kind of bring those together for those quartet of images. And I hope to be working on some of that while I'm at Sitka, in addition to the science work.
Janet, thank you so much. Some comments in the chat. Judy shares for all of you, what a fabulous and delightful energy from these residents. Bravo. And Dawn shares, this is really great. Thank you to all for making this happen and for all those who spent time preparing this virtual sharing for us. Randy shares, this is my second Sitka show and tell. Want to thank all who worked on these presentations. You are impacting my art practices, indeed, my life practices. I couldn't agree more. So thank you so much to Ayla, Emily, Jane, Danielle, and Janet for sharing your work with us tonight. Welcome to Sitka. Happy New Year, Sitka community. Thanks so many for turning out tonight. We had over 80 participants here on Zoom and usually dozens more live streaming on other virtual platforms too. So well over 100 Sitka people coming together tonight for this show. Thanks everyone. Good night. Happy New Year.